The crowbar made a wet sucking sound as Detective Sarah Chen pried up the third floorboard in cabin 7, the same sound that had haunted her dreams for the past 6 months. The Craftsman Professional 24-inch pry bar, borrowed from the maintenance shed behind the Osceola County Sheriff's Office, bit deep into the waterlogged pine with a resistance that spoke of decades of Michigan winters and summers. Beneath the rotting wood, carved into the subflooring with what appeared to be a broken spoon handle, the kind used in the camp mess hall, Chen would later determine were the names Tommy R., Lisa M., David K., 43 names in total, etched in desperate, childish handwriting that seemed to whisper from the darkness of the abandoned summer camp. The letters were crude but deliberate, each stroke carved with the determination of a child who knew their time was running out. Some names were accompanied by ages: Billy T., 8 years asterisk, Michelle S., 14. Others included hometown references: Amy from Detroit, Carlos, Grand Rapids. The wood around each carving was stained dark, as if the children had mixed their tears with dirt to make the letters more visible. It was October 15, 2024, 6:47 a.m., according to Chen's Casio G-Shock DW5600E. 45 years and 3 months after the children had vanished from Camp Crystal Lake without a trace. The temperature had dropped to 32 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, and her breath formed small clouds in the frigid air of the unheated cabin. The morning mist clung to the 847 acres of surrounding Michigan pines like funeral shrouds, reducing visibility to less than 50 feet in any direction. Chen could taste the metallic tang of old fear in the air, a combination of rust from the cabin's corrugated metal roof, mildew from the rotting floorboards, and something else. Something organic and wrong that seemed to seep from the very walls. The Nikon D850 camera hanging around her neck felt heavier than usual, as she knelt beside the evidence that would finally crack open the most haunting cold case in Osceola County history. Her blue nitrile gloves, size medium from the evidence kit in her 2019 Ford Explorer, were already stained with decades of accumulated grime and what appeared to be rust-colored stains that she preferred not to identify just yet. Now, 31 years into her career with the Michigan State Police, starting as a trooper fresh out of the academy in 1993, working her way up through detective in 1998, senior detective in 2005, and finally to her current position as detective sergeant with the Criminal Investigation Division. Chen stood in the same cabin where young Tommy Rodriguez had once slept in bunk bed number 7, lower mattress, according to the camp record she had memorized. His name was carved into the wood beneath her feet like a gravestone epitaph, the letters barely visible in the LED beam of her Streamlight ProTac HLX tactical flashlight. The floorboards were soft with rot, yielding to her crowbar with the consistency of wet cardboard soaked in 45 years of Michigan weather. Each plank she removed, 12-inch wide tongue-and-groove pine boards, she noted for her evidence log, revealed another layer of the nightmare. Not just names, but dates etched in the same desperate handwriting. Nimes July 24th asterisk, Nimes July 25th asterisk, Nimes July 26th. Crude maps scratched into the wood, showing the layout of what appeared to be an underground chamber. Tally marks counting days, grouped in sets of 5 like a prisoner marking time, and what appeared to be a message system carved by children who knew they were going to die. Arrows pointing to different sections of the subflooring, numbers that might have indicated the order in which the messages should be read, and heartbreaking final words. Tell my mom I was brave. The breakthrough had come 2 days earlier at 3:47 p.m. when Chen received a call from Emma Whitmore on her department-issued Samsung Galaxy S23. Whitmore was the camp's current caretaker, hired by Great Lakes Property Management Company to prevent vandalism and maintain the slowly deteriorating buildings. The 72-year-old former nurse had been winterizing the abandoned structures, a process that involved draining the water pipes, boarding up broken windows with sheets of half-inch plywood, and checking for structural damage that might pose a liability, when she heard what sounded like voices coming from beneath cabin 7. At first I thought it was just the wind whistling through the loose floorboards, Whitmore had told Chen over the phone, her voice shaking with a tremor that could have been age or fear. But then I got down on my hands and knees with my Maglite flashlight, and I realized the voices were saying names, children's names, clear as day like they were right there underneath me. Whitmore had been working at the camp since 2009, 15 years of routine maintenance, during which she had never heard anything unusual. She knew the history of the place. Everyone in Osceola County knew about the missing children, but she had always assumed it was just another tragic unsolved case, the kind that happens too often in rural America. The first thing Chen noticed when she arrived at 4:23 p.m. on October 13th was the complete absence of sound. No bird calls, not even the harsh caw of crows that typically inhabited dead timber. No rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no chittering of squirrels or rustling of mice in the fallen leaves. Even the October wind, which had been gusting to 15 miles per hour according to her car's weather display during the drive north, seemed muted here, as if the very air around Camp Crystal Lake had absorbed the screams of 43 children and held them prisoner for 4 decades. The silence was so complete that Chen could hear the electrical hum of her digital camera, the soft whisper of her nylon jacket against itself as she moved, and the distant lapping of lake water against the deteriorating dock, a rhythmic sound like a slow heartbeat that seemed to echo the camp's dying pulse. Even her footsteps on the gravel path, which should have crunched loudly on the limestone chips that Brennan had laid down in 1968, were mysteriously muffled, as if the very ground was conspiring to keep the camp's secrets buried. Whitmore met her at the rusted front gate, a wrought iron barrier that had once been painted white, but now showed more rust than metal, working the combination lock with arthritic fingers that fumbled through the sequence. July 23, 79, the date of the disappearances. "Mr. Brennan's idea of a memorial, I suppose," she said grimly. The lock was an old master lock, no 1500D, the kind used on school lockers in the 1970s, and it resisted opening until Whitmore applied penetrating oil from a small can of WD-40 she carried in her maintenance toolkit. "I've been the caretaker here for 15 years, she said, leading Chen down the overgrown path toward the cluster of cabins, her Red Wing work boots crunching through the layer of fallen maple and oak leaves that no one had raked since 1979. "Worked for Great Lakes Property Management since I retired from nursing at Mercy Hospital in Cadillac. Never heard anything like this before. It's like they're trying to tell us something." As they walked, Whitmore pointed out landmarks with the practiced tour guide manner of someone who had spent years showing insurance investigators, lawyers, and curious journalists around the property. "That's the mess hall where they had their last dinner," she said, indicating a low building with a rusted metal roof. "And over there's the Arts and Crafts building, where little Amy Martinez was making a friendship bracelet for her mother. Never finished it. It's probably still sitting on the table where she left it." Cabin 7 sat at the far end of the camp, exactly 847 feet from the main lodge according to the original architectural plans Chen had studied. It was closest to the dense pine forest that stretched unbroken for 73 miles to the north, toward the Mackinac Bridge and the Upper Peninsula. The structure sagged under the weight of decades of neglect, its post and beam foundation slowly sinking into the soft, sandy soil that was typical of the region. The cabin measured 24 feet by 16 feet, built to house 8 campers and 4 bunk beds arranged along the walls, with a small common area in the center containing 2 wooden chairs and a card table where the children would write letters home or play board games during rainy weather. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something sweet and cloying that made Chen's stomach turn and reminded her of the decomposition odors she had encountered at crime scenes throughout her career. The floorboards, once polished pine that had gleamed golden in the summer sunlight streaming through the windows, were now warped and discolored, stained with water damage and what appeared to be organic matter that had seeped up from below over the decades. Cobwebs hung like tattered curtains from the exposed ceiling beams, and mouse droppings were scattered across every surface, evidence of the rodents that had claimed the abandoned building as their own. "The voices were strongest right here," Whitmore said, pointing to a spot near the center of the cabin, approximately 6 feet from the east wall and 4 feet from the south wall, according to Chen's mental measurements. "Right around midnight on October 11th, I was doing my monthly security check, making sure no vandals had broken in. I always carry my father's old Timex pocket watch, and I remember checking it because the voices started so suddenly. Just whispers at first, like children talking in their sleep, then clearer. Names being called, over and over. Tommy, Lisa, Sarah, David. Names I recognized from the old newspaper clippings I keep in my filing cabinet at home. I've collected every article about the disappearances for 15 years, trying to understand what happened here. Whitmore's voice dropped to nearly a whisper as she continued. But then I heard something else, scratching sounds, like fingernails on wood, and crying, soft sobbing that seemed to come from directly beneath my feet. That's when I knew I wasn't imagining things. Chen knelt on the rotting floorboards, feeling them flex and give beneath her 140-pound frame, and pressed her ear to the wood exactly where Whitmore had indicated. The boards were warped with age and moisture, creating small gaps between them that allowed air to circulate from the space below. At first she heard nothing except the distant sound of wind in the pines and the faint creaking of the cabin's settling timbers. Then, just as she was about to stand, she detected a faint scratching sound, rhythmic, deliberate, like Morse code tapped out by an invisible finger. The sound lasted for exactly 17 seconds according to her watch, then stopped abruptly. Chen held her breath, pressing her ear harder against the wood, and heard it again. Scratch, 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 pause, scratch, scratch, pause, scratch, scratch, scratch. She stood quickly, her heart hammering at 120 beats per minute, according to her fitness tracker, a cold sweat breaking out across her forehead despite the October chill. "Did you hear that?" she asked Whitmore, who was standing near the doorway, clutching her maintenance clipboard like a shield. Whitmore nodded grimly, her face pale in the dim light filtering through the broken windows. "That's exactly what I heard. Started Tuesday night, same pattern every time. 3 scratches, pause, 2 scratches, pause, 3 scratches. Like someone trying to spell out SOS in Morse code. My late husband Earl was in the Navy, served on the USS Michigan during the Cold War, and he taught me some of the basic signals. This is definitely SOS, over and over again." She pulled a small digital voice recorder from her jacket pocket, a Sony IC-DPX 470. "I've been recording it the past 2 nights. Here, listen to this." The device crackled with static for a moment. Then Chen heard the unmistakable sound of scratching wood, followed by what could only be described as whispered voices. "Help us. Please. Somebody help us." The voices were faint but distinctly human, definitely children, with the characteristic pitch and cadence of young people in distress. "That's when I called you," Whitmore said, clicking off the recorder. "I've been around death my whole career as a nurse. I've seen people die, I've comforted families, I've dealt with grief and loss for 40 years. But I've never heard anything like this. These children are trying to communicate with us." Chen returned to her Ford Explorer, parked outside the camp's perimeter fence, and retrieved her investigation kit from the rear cargo area. The kit was a Pelican 1650 hard case containing everything she might need for a preliminary evidence collection. Digital cameras, measuring tape, evidence bags, latex gloves, sample containers, a metal detector, and basic forensic tools. She also grabbed her crowbar, the Craftsman Professional 24-inch pry bar that had helped her solve dozens of cases over the past decade, and her portable LED floodlights, battery-powered units that could illuminate a crime scene for up to 8 hours. Something about the floorboards in Cabin 7 looked wrong to her trained eye. After 26 years of investigating crime scenes, she had developed an instinct for details that didn't belong, anomalies that suggested human interference with the natural order of decay and abandonment. Several of the boards near the center of the cabin appeared newer than the others, with bright galvanized nails that showed no signs of rust despite the humid environment. The wood grain didn't quite match the surrounding boards, and there were tool marks on the edges that suggested recent installation, though recent in an abandoned building could mean anywhere from 5 to 20 years ago. As she began to pry up the first plank, a musty smell rose from the darkness below, mixed with something that reminded her of the basement of her childhood home, damp earth and forgotten things. The first name she found was carved in block letters, Sarah K. Not her own name, but close enough to send a chill down her spine. Below it, in the same desperate handwriting, not her HLPUS. Chen's hands shook as she photographed the carving, the camera flash illuminating the message like a lightning strike in the dark. As she worked her way across the cabin floor, a horrifying picture began to emerge. The children hadn't simply vanished. They had been trapped beneath the floorboards, alive and conscious, leaving behind a record of their final days carved into the wood above their heads. The messages grew more desperate with each board she removed. Day 3. No food. Tommy is sick. Please find U.S. Chen had seen plenty of horror in her career, but nothing had prepared her for this. The realization that 43 children had died slowly, inches beneath the feet of the searchers who had combed the cabin for evidence, was almost too much to process. She sat back on her heels, fighting the urge to vomit, and called her supervisor. "I need the full forensic team up here," she told Lieutenant Marcus Williams, her voice hoarse. "And the coroner. We're going to need a lot of body bags." Williams had been Chen's partner during her first years with the state police, and he knew her well enough to hear the strain in her voice. "What did you find, Sarah?" Chen looked down at the names carved into the subflooring, illuminated by her flashlight like a memorial wall. "I found them, Marcus. I found all of them." The forensic team arrived within 3 hours, led by Dr. Jennifer Morrison, a forensic anthropologist from Western Michigan University. Morrison had worked dozens of mass grave sites, but even she seemed shaken as she examined the carved messages. "The psychological implications of this are staggering," she told Chen as they documented each name. "These children were essentially buried alive, but they remained conscious long enough to leave us a record of their experience." The excavation began at dawn the next morning. Morrison's team worked with archaeological precision, removing each floorboard and cataloging its contents, before beginning the delicate process of excavating the space beneath. The cavity was larger than Chen had expected, nearly the entire footprint of the cabin, dug to a depth of about 6 feet. The walls were lined with rough-hewn planks, creating an underground chamber that someone had obviously prepared in advance. The first skeletal remains were discovered just 18 inches below the surface. The bones were small, clearly belonging to a child, and they were arranged in a rough circle around what appeared to be a central gathering place. As the excavation continued, a nightmarish scene emerged. 43 skeletons ranging in age from 8 to 15, positioned as if they had been holding hands in their final moments. Dr. Morrison worked carefully to identify each set of remains, using dental records and clothing fragments to match them with the missing children. The preservation was remarkable. The dry conditions beneath the cabin had essentially mummified the remains, leaving behind not just bones, but fragments of clothing, personal effects, and even some soft tissue. Tommy Rodriguez had been wearing a Detroit Tigers t-shirt when he died. Lisa Martinez still had her camp friendship bracelet around her wrist. David Kim's glasses were found nearby, the lenses long since cracked but the frames intact. Each discovery was like a punch to Chen's gut, transforming the abstract horror of 43 missing children into the concrete reality of 43 individual deaths. The evidence suggested that the children had been trapped in the underground chamber for at least a week, possibly longer. The carved messages traced their psychological journey from hope to despair to acceptance. The earliest carvings were optimistic. "Someone will find you. Dad is looking for me." The later messages revealed the horrifying truth. "No one is coming. I'm sorry, Mom. Tell Jenny I love her." Chen found herself particularly drawn to the messages left by Sarah Kowalski, the 12-year-old whose name had been the first she'd uncovered. Sarah had been the camp's junior counselor, and her carvings revealed a young person trying to maintain hope and order even in the face of certain death. "Stay strong," she had carved. "Help is coming." And finally, in letters that grew increasingly faint and shaky, "Cried to save them." The investigation into how the children had ended up in the underground chamber led Chen deep into the camp's history. Camp Crystal Lake had been founded in 1967 by Harold Brennan, a former Methodist minister who had purchased the property with money inherited from his wealthy father. Brennan had marketed the camp as a place where children could discover God's love in the beauty of nature, and it had quickly become popular with families throughout the Great Lakes region. Chen spent hours in the basement of the Osceola County Courthouse, poring over property records and building permits. She discovered that Brennan had filed for numerous construction permits between 1967 and 1979, including one in 1978 for foundation repairs to Cabin 7. The permit had been approved by the county building inspector, a man named Robert Hickman, who had died in a car accident just 3 months after the children's disappearance. Brennan himself had vanished on the same night as the children, leaving behind only a note that read, "I have gone to prepare a place for them." The FBI had assumed he had fled to avoid prosecution, but Chen began to wonder if his disappearance was connected to the children's deaths in a more direct way. The breakthrough came when Morrison's team discovered a second chamber beneath the cabin, this one containing adult skeletal remains. The bones were those of a man in his 50s, and fragments of clothing suggested he had been wearing a Methodist minister's collar when he died. A tarnished name tag found near the remains confirmed Chen's suspicion: Nimes Reverend Harold Brennan, camp director. The evidence suggested that Brennan had been in the chamber with the children when they died, but his remains were found in a separate section, surrounded by empty bottles that had once contained sleeping pills. A final message carved into the wall near his body read, "Forgive me for what I have done." Chen pieced together the horrifying sequence of events through a combination of forensic evidence and witness interviews. Brennan had been struggling with what camp counselors described as increasing erratic behavior throughout the summer of 1979. Several former staff members told Chen that Brennan had become obsessed with the idea that the modern world was corrupt and that the children in his care needed to be protected from its influence. The construction of the underground chamber had been carefully planned over the course of more than a year. Brennan had used the foundation repair permit as cover, excavating the space during the off-season when no one else was around. He had installed a ventilation system that would keep the children alive for several days, along with a small cache of food and water. On the night of July 23, 1979, Brennan had gathered all 43 children in the dining hall for what he called a special ceremony. He had drugged their dinner with a powerful sedative, then carried their unconscious bodies to the chamber beneath Cabin 7. Chen theorized that Brennan had intended the chamber to be a temporary refuge, believing that he was protecting the children from some imagined threat. But something had gone wrong. Perhaps the ventilation system had failed, or Brennan had suffered a psychological breakdown, and what was meant to be protection had become a tomb. The children had awakened to find themselves trapped in the dark chamber, with only Brennan's increasingly incoherent explanations for their situation. The carved messages suggested that he had tried to maintain the pretense that they were hiding from danger, but the children had quickly realized the truth. As their food and water ran out, and the air in the chamber grew increasingly stale, panic had set in. Sarah Kowalski's final message, carved in letters so faint they were barely visible, provided the most heartbreaking glimpse into their final hours. "We forgive you, Mr. Brennan." The words were surrounded by the signatures of all 43 children, a final act of grace that left Chen weeping as she photographed the evidence. The discovery of the children's remains brought closure to families who had spent 45 years wondering what had happened to their loved ones, but it also opened old wounds. Chen attended memorial services for children who had been dead for decades, watching elderly parents weep over caskets that contained only fragments of the children they had lost. Margaret Rodriguez, Tommy's mother, was now 87 years old and confined to a wheelchair, but she insisted on attending the excavation site. "I knew he was still here," she told Chen, her voice barely above a whisper. "I could feel him calling to me every time I drove past this place." She had visited the camp dozens of times over the decades, always stopping at Cabin 7, never knowing that her son lay just beneath her feet. The Rodriguez family had been torn apart by Tommy's disappearance. His father had died of a heart attack just 2 years later, and his older sister had struggled with depression and substance abuse for decades. Margaret had dedicated her life to searching for her son, funding private investigators and psychics, always hoping for news that never came. The discovery of his remains brought both relief and devastating grief. Relief that the waiting was over, and grief for the 57 years of life that had been stolen from him. Chen found herself drawn into the family's pain, attending therapy sessions and support group meetings as they processed their loss. The parents had formed a tight-knit community over the decades, bound together by their shared experience of unimaginable loss. They had aged together, mourned together, and now they were finally able to bury their children together. The forensic evidence painted a picture of children who had faced their deaths with remarkable courage and maturity. The carved messages revealed acts of selflessness and compassion even in their final hours. The older children had comforted the younger ones, sharing their meager rations and taking turns sleeping so that someone was always awake to watch over the group. David Kim, who had been 14 when he died, had carved an elaborate map of the chamber on one of the walls, marking the locations of the water supply and the ventilation shaft. He had also left detailed observations about the air quality and temperature, creating a scientific record of their deteriorating conditions. His parents, both retired professors, wept as they read his final words. "I love you, Mom and Dad. I tried to be brave like you taught me." The investigation also revealed the extent to which the original search had been compromised by incompetence and cover-ups. Chen discovered that several key pieces of evidence had been overlooked or deliberately suppressed. The county building inspector who had approved Brennan's construction permits had been taking bribes from local contractors, and he had never actually inspected the work being done at the camp. His sudden death in a car accident had eliminated the only person who might have known about the underground chamber. The FBI agent who had led the original investigation, retired Agent William Patterson, agreed to meet with Chen at his home in Traverse City. Patterson was in his 70s now, his health failing, but his memory of the case remained sharp. "We knew something was wrong from the beginning," he told Chen as they sat in his cluttered home office. "But we couldn't make sense of it. 43 children don't just vanish into thin air." Patterson admitted that the FBI had suspected Brennan from the start, but they had been unable to prove his involvement. He was the perfect suspect, access to the children, knowledge of the camp layout, and he disappeared at the same time. But without a body or any physical evidence, we couldn't build a case. The agent revealed that the FBI had actually searched Cabin 7 during the original investigation, but they had used metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar, which had failed to detect the wooden chamber beneath the floorboards. The technology wasn't as advanced then, Patterson explained. And frankly, we were looking for graves, not underground rooms. It never occurred to us that someone would build a chamber specifically to hide the children. Chen also learned that several camp counselors had reported suspicious behavior from Brennan in the weeks before the disappearances, but their concerns had been dismissed by local authorities. Jennifer Walsh, who had been 19 when she worked at the camp, told Chen that Brennan had been increasingly paranoid and religious throughout the summer. He kept talking about how the children needed to be protected from the, quote, corruption of the outside world, Walsh recalled. "We thought he was just being overly protective." Walsh had been scheduled to work the night the children disappeared, but Brennan had sent her home early, claiming he wanted to handle the evening activities himself. "I should have known something was wrong," she told Chen, tears streaming down her face. "Those children were my responsibility, and I failed them." The revelation that the children had been trapped beneath the camp for days, while hundreds of searchers combed the area above them, was almost too horrifying to comprehend. Chen struggled with her own guilt, wondering if she could have solved the case sooner if she had approached it differently. The weight of 43 young lives pressed down on her, and she found herself seeking therapy to process the trauma of the investigation. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a psychologist who specialized in working with law enforcement officers, helped Chen understand that her reaction was normal and healthy. "You're experiencing secondary trauma," Harper explained during one of their sessions. "When you immerse yourself in a case like this, you absorb some of the victim's pain. It's a sign that you care, not a sign of weakness." The therapy sessions helped Chen process not just the horror of the case, but also her own childhood memories of the disappearances. She remembered the fear that had gripped her community, the way parents had suddenly become overprotective, the way summer camp had been transformed from a place of joy to a source of terror. She had been the same age as many of the victims, and their deaths had shaped her worldview in ways she was only now beginning to understand. The case also had a profound impact on the broader community. The revelation that the children had been so close, trapped just beneath the floorboards while their families searched desperately for them, reopened old wounds and created new ones. Property values around Crystal Lake plummeted as the media attention brought unwanted scrutiny to the area. The lake itself, once a popular destination for tourists and locals, became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand the tragedy. Chen worked with the families to plan a memorial service that would honor the children's memory while providing closure for the community. The service was held at the site of the former camp, with the ruins of Cabin 7 serving as a backdrop. Religious leaders from multiple faiths participated, and hundreds of people attended, including many who had been children themselves in 1979. The memorial featured individual tributes to each of the 43 children, with family members sharing memories and photographs. Tommy Rodriguez's sister spoke about his love of baseball and his dreams of playing for the Detroit Tigers. Lisa Martinez's parents remembered her artistic talent and her plans to become a teacher. David Kim's professor parents quoted from his final carved message, praising his courage and scientific curiosity even in the face of death. The service concluded with the reading of Sarah Kowalski's final message, "We forgive you, Mr. Brennan." The words hung in the air like a benediction, a final act of grace from children who had faced unimaginable horror with remarkable compassion. In the months following the discovery, Chen continued to investigate the broader implications of the case. She discovered that similar incidents had occurred at other camps and youth organizations, suggesting a pattern of institutional abuse and neglect that had been covered up for decades. Her work contributed to new regulations and oversight procedures designed to prevent similar tragedies. The physical evidence from the case was preserved in the Michigan State Police Forensic Laboratory, where it would remain available for future researchers and investigators. The carved messages were carefully photographed and documented, creating a permanent record of the children's final days. The cabin itself was demolished, but the site was preserved as a memorial garden where visitors could pay their respects to the victims. Chen returned to the site one final time on a cold December morning, 6 months after the discovery. Snow covered the ground where Cabin 7 had stood, and the lake was frozen solid. She knelt at the memorial stone that had been erected in honor of the children, reading each name carved into the granite. The silence was complete now. No whispers from beneath the floorboards, no voices calling out in the darkness. As she stood to leave, Chen noticed something carved into the bark of a nearby pine tree. Sarah K. plus Tommy R. plus Lisa M. plus David K. plus all of US equals forever. The message was fresh, carved within the past few days, and Chen realized that someone, perhaps a family member, perhaps a stranger moved by the story, had left a final tribute to the children of Camp Crystal Lake. The case officially closed on January 15, 2025, 45 years and 5 months after the children had vanished. The deaths were ruled homicides, with Harold Brennan identified as the perpetrator. The families finally had the answers they had sought for nearly half a century, but the cost of that knowledge was almost too high to bear. Chen kept copies of the children's final messages in her desk drawer, reading them whenever she felt overwhelmed by the darkness of her work. Their words served as a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable evil, the human spirit could find ways to express love, hope, and forgiveness. The children of Camp Crystal Lake had been victims of a terrible crime, but they had also been heroes, facing their deaths with courage and grace that inspired everyone who learned their story. The 43 names carved into the subflooring of Cabin 7 would never be forgotten. They had been silent for 45 years, but their voices had finally been heard. In finding them, Chen had not only solved the most haunting cold case in Michigan history, she had given 43 children the dignity of a proper burial, and 43 families the closure they had desperately needed. The whispers from beneath the floorboards had been silenced, but their message lived on. Even in the darkest moments, even when hope seems lost, love finds a way to survive. The children of Camp Crystal Lake had carved their names into history, and their story would be told for generations to come, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of truth to triumph over darkness. In the end, they had not died in vain. Their discovery had led to changes in camp safety regulations, improved coordination between law enforcement agencies, and a renewed commitment to protecting children from those who would harm them. The names carved into the subflooring had become a rallying cry for justice, a reminder that every child deserves to be safe, protected, and loved. Detective Sarah Chen closed the case file for the final time, but she knew that the children of Camp Crystal Lake would remain with her forever. Their voices had been heard, their story had been told, and their memory would live on in the hearts of all who learned about their courage in the face of unimaginable terror. The investigation was over, but the healing had just begun.